Well, good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to see you this morning. Pastor Dan didn't tell you all the story. He was very kind. We told him there would be a church here, and when he drove up, there was a metal building package laying on the concrete. It was a church, it just wasn't built, and so had a lot to do. And he and Linda have just poured themselves into this church over the years, and other leaders. Marty, there's a lot of staff. I start naming people, then I'll forget someone, but they have just been a blessing in many ways, and I'm glad that you're part of the church. It's my privilege, my job, if you will, to be in a different church every Sunday, sometimes a couple of churches, Sunday morning and Sunday night. We have 103 churches. You divide that by 52, once every couple of years I get to come around, and we get to go to so many different kinds of churches. Churches like yours, more contemporary churches. We go to churches where everybody's dressed very formally and the organ music's playing. We go to churches out in the middle of the country. We go to churches where nobody speaks English. And when I speak, somebody translates, and I hope they're saying what I'm saying. I don't really know. But it's a blessing to do that. And we appreciate what God's doing here. We've always believed that this is just a great place, and there are many things that can be accomplished. And we appreciate what He's doing. I want to talk to you about a little different subject this morning, something that you maybe wouldn't hear all the time. And let me preface it by saying this. The early church grew like crazy for one reason. Because the people were so unusual. And I don't mean weird. Some Christians are weird. Some weird Christians, just really strange people. But they were just so unusual. There was something about them that people would see them and say, I got to have that. I've got to be that way. I need to know what that is. So I want to start by showing you a picture, something that you've probably seen before. It's a cow eating. Now, if you see that, here's my question. Do you see grass? You see what he's up to his neck in barbed wire, eating the grass on the other side of the fence. So you get that picture. Does the grass on the side of the fence he's eating look better to you than the grass where he's at? To me, I don't see much. Now, I've never been a cow. I'm not in lives where I've been reincarnated or things like that. But I never understood this, except I would tell you that is the picture of the average person in our culture. They may have acres and acres inside their pasture, but all they can see is what they don't have. And so let me give you a couple of verses. The first one's a psalm, and it's actually Psalm chapter 16 says, Lord, you've assigned me my portion and my cup. You've made my lot secure. Now, listen to this. The boundary lines for me have fallen in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. In other words, the psalmist says, you know what, Lord? What you have put inside my fence is good. I appreciate the boundary you've given me. Now, let me go to another verse, and we're going to bounce off these two. This is from the Apostle Paul. Let me tell you a little bit about Paul. He's in trouble everywhere he goes. In fact, when he writes this letter back to the church, it's because he had been kicked out after 3 weeks. That was one of his longer pastorates. He was all the time getting in trouble because he was in a culture that didn't want to hear anything about Christianity, didn't want to hear anything about Jesus. But he sends back this verse, which is kind of a prayer, and he says, rejoice always. Pray, and the old version says, pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all things, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Now I want you to see that other highlighted part. May God Himself, the God of peace, you see that, sanctify you through and through. What is that all about? He says that He is faithful and He can do it. So I want to talk to you a little bit about restlessness, about somehow coming to a point in your life where you can say, you know what, Lord? I like where the fence is. I like what you have given me. Because here's the problem, is when you tell everybody how much the Lord has done for you, and then you're up to your neck in the barbed wire trying to eat outside the fence, what you're saying is the Lord's done a lot for me, but He hasn't done enough. He hasn't really given me the desires of my heart. He hasn't really given me what I need the most. So let me share 2 or 3 simple things. The first one is this. Restlessness is not always bad. This is hard for Americans because we are a restless people. We are a driven people. Not every culture is like ours. If you visited in other places around the world, you'd realize not every culture is like ours. But it is not always bad. Let's talk about some people in the Bible. Nehemiah. You remember Nehemiah? He went to rebuild the wall. It's a long story. What happens is he's sitting in the palace. He works for the king. He's like the right-hand man of the king. And so some people come from Jerusalem, and he said, how are things going in Jerusalem? And they said, not good. The wall's torn down. The temple's gone. There's nothing left there. And at that moment, even though he's 800 miles away, and it would be a while before he could go, at that moment, God put in his heart a desire to go back and to rebuild the city, to rebuild the wall. Now you say, well, somebody else rebuilt the temple. Yeah, they did. But in that culture, you really couldn't establish a city until you had a wall for safety. And Nehemiah goes back, and the first days he rides through and he sees that the wall's torn down, and he says, we're going to rebuild this wall. And he rebuilt the wall. What about the children of Israel? I got a picture of the Jordan River at flood stage. The Jordan River, if you see it most of the time, looks like this little muddy creek, but at flood stage, it's not anything you want to mess with. I don't know if you've ever tried to cross a river. I'm from the mountains of western North Carolina. We get flash floods all the time. And you think, well, I could just cross this little stream, and you get about 2 feet into it, and you realize you don't want any part of that. In fact, one of my family members is a volunteer fireman, and they had to rescue a family, and they had to tie them off to a tree, and the strongest men they had to do everything they could to fight the current to get a little baby. Well, here they're standing on one side of the Jordan River. All of their ancestors have died in the desert. And they're standing there, and they can't wait to get on the other side. God put that in their heart. There's not anything wrong with wanting to do something. The picture I have is supposed to be Zacchaeus. It's supposed to be the actual tree that Zacchaeus was in. Now, some of you that, I'm going old school, I'm going way old school, but some of you that grew up in church, we would say Zacchaeus was what kind of man? He was a wee little man. He wasn't just little, he wasn't just wee, he was wee and little. I mean, he was a wee little man. He was a little guy, but he was a guy that nobody could stand because he was a tax collector. Now, you think the IRS is bad today. The IRS in those days were the tax collectors, and they had full authority. Basically, they could collect whatever they wanted, and they had the authority to do it. They owed so much to the government, and then they would just basically get money from you, and he had done very well. And so we find him one day. I mean, he's a man of culture. They're supposed to be dignified. Where do we find him? Jesus is coming through in the crowd, and because he is a wee little man, because he can't see, he's up in the tree. And Jesus, I mean, can you imagine? He's walking through, and maybe nobody's seen Zacchaeus yet because it's, this mighty tree, and Jesus is walking along, and then he speaks to him. And he says, why don't you come down? And he invites him to lunch, and his whole life changes. But the moment that Jesus said to him, Zacchaeus, come down. I want to have lunch with you. God put in his heart a desire to change. It's not just them, it's our country. I mean, we wouldn't have America if it wasn't for restlessness. And if it wasn't for restlessness, all of America would be located on the East Coast. Now, you think about some people that live in the western part of the country. Aren't you glad they kept moving? I mean, I shouldn't say that. I have a daughter that lives in California. But the thing is, it was restlessness that brought people here, those pilgrims that pack on those ships. I mean, you watch it in the movies, it looks like they're on a cruise boat almost with a little wooden facade, and they're coming over here. I mean, people died on their way over here. They starved to death those first years, but they were driven because they believed that they should be at a place where they could worship the way they wanted to. They wanted to be free. It wasn't just that. When they got here, they went out west. They kept moving. I remember Daniel Boone. I used to watch Daniel Boone when I was a kid. It was on every day. This is back when there was 3 channels. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot to watch. I'm sure we'd be watching some reality show now if we were kids. But Daniel Boone was always pressing, always going farther because there's something in that spirit that drove people until they hit the other coast, even though it's 3,000 miles away. That restlessness that drove people. It's restlessness that caused somebody to stand on the ground one night and look up at the moon and say, we could stand up there. We could put a flag up there. It's restlessness that drives people who look like little professors into their labs day after day to experiment to get rid of diseases that are ruining people's lives. See, restlessness is not bad in and of itself. There is a restlessness that God puts in our heart, and He drives us. Here's the second truth. Restlessness often will make a statement about our priorities. We often show our heart. We show what really does matter to us. And that's where we have problems when we come in contact with the world. You know the story. The prodigal son goes to his father. His father's wealthy, and he asks for his inheritance. Now, that doesn't sound all that bad. I want you to think about it. If you have a parent that is near the end of their life, or maybe they're not near the end of their life, they just retired and have a few years left, and you went to them and said, you know what, I'd like to just, could I just have my stuff now? That's a little awkward, isn't it? Do you know in their culture what he was really saying to his father? He was saying, I wish you were dead. Because if you were dead, I could have your stuff. And what I really want is not you as a father. What I want is your stuff. I'd rather have the things. And I wonder in our heart of hearts, if we talk about this line of inheritance, how many people would say, I'd rather have the things that my parents have. I'd rather have the things from the relationship than have the people. And so the father, in a surprise, gives him his stuff. He gets 1/3 of the inheritance. And he goes off, and you remember the story. As long as he's got money, he's got friends. And some things never change, right? I mean, as long as he's got money, he's got people all around him. Once the money's gone, the friends are gone. You know why? Because his friends aren't any different than him. He wanted his stuff from his dad. They wanted stuff from him. When he can't give them stuff, they're checking out. They're done. And so one day, while he's eating leftovers from what the pigs eat, he thinks to himself, you know, I could go back to my father's house. Even the lowest level job at my father's house would be better than this. And he does. He goes back to his father's house. Think about Abram and Lot. They are standing. They're looking out over the plain. And now, again, we have to get in Jewish culture. Maybe we don't understand this. But Abram, was, as he was known then, before they called him Abraham, had literally led the people of God. And God had blessed them so much that his nephew, who was kind of a tag-along, their crops, their livestock were so much that the land wouldn't support them anymore. And they realized we've got to separate. We can't stay together. There's just too much. And so they stand up and they look out, and Abraham says to Lot, which way would you prefer? Now again, if you know the culture, in their culture, the right answer for Lot is, doesn't matter what I want. You're my elder. You're the one that has seen that I've been blessed. You make the choice and I'll go. But not Lot. He looks out this way and sees a beautiful plain. He looks out that way and sees not much, and he says, I'll take this. Because again, even though he loved Abraham, he was around Abraham so he could have his stuff, so he could be blessed from him. So he makes that choice. There's a man in the New Testament, Jesus tells us a story. And he was blessed so much, and his crops grew. And I never understood this. I guess he just didn't have enough land. You remember what his decision was? He said, the only thing I know to do is tear down my barns and build bigger barns. I've got so much stuff, I can't support them. He evidently couldn't build more. I'll tear them down, and I'll build bigger barns because I want more things. In the story, Jesus said, you fool, your life is going to be required this night. You made the wrong choice. I don't know if we have the slide of the survey, what people would do for $10 million. Look at this. This is a popular internet survey. This is what people in America said they would do for $10 million. I'm not going to read through those. There's some amazing answers there. I only want to make 2 points. One is, even as you've seen that slide, there have probably been some people in this room that said, for $10 million, there are a couple of those things I might be willing to do. The second is, we believe that what will change our lives is $10 million. Now, that'd be a good start, wouldn't it? I mean, if we were giving out $10 million checks at the end of the service, how many of you would turn them down? Probably not a lot. Do you have those checks? Pastor Dan's got those? Just don't cash them till he can get out of the country. But that's what we think. We always think this is what would make me happy. This is what it would take. In fact, I don't have this slide, but years ago they did a survey and they said they took people at income levels. And I don't know, that let's say up to $50,000 and then 50 to 75 and then 75 to 100, whatever they were, but they divided into income levels and they said, what would it take for you to be happy? And almost 90% of the people chose the next income level up. But if they came back in a few years and asked them, guess what they chose again? The next one up. Now, this is not saying money is wrong. It's not the point at all. The point is there something in your life that would be enough? Is there a point where you'd say, God has blessed me? And let me tell you how radical that would be. I want you to imagine sitting around work, and we all work in different places. Some of you work in cubicles, some of you where you're traveling all the time. But let's say you're standing around the workplace and the discussion comes up and people are like, boy, I'd love to win the lottery. I'd love to do this. And they go back and forth and it comes around to you and you say, you know what? I've been thinking about it. God's blessed me so much, I pretty much have the things I need. First of all, they wouldn't hang around you for a little while. They'd be, well, that person's strange. I mean, nobody thinks like that in our culture. But here's the thing, if you're not thinking like that, are you not saying, God, you owe me. You need to give me more. You need to bless me more. And again, it's not about income. In fact, a lot of people that have things have a much better perspective of life. They don't even focus on those things. They focus on the things that are important. Here's the third truth. Ultimately, restlessness will open the door to spiritual failure. A restless heart will always catch up with you. A heart that cannot go to God and say, Lord, I thank you for what you've given me. I want you to show me the best way to invest it, the best way to use it, and I know that you will give me the things I need. A restless heart will always catch up with you. Adam and Eve. We get into that discussion on whose fault it was. Looks like there's more ladies in here today, so I think I know how that vote would go, okay? But here's the point. Remember how Satan tempted them? He didn't say, you'll be popular, all this. He said, God does not want you to eat of that tree, the fruit of that tree, because he knows that if you do, you'll be just like him. Now remember, they're in the Garden of Eden. They have everything. I mean, it's like a picture of heaven. I mean, life could not be more perfect. In fact, they had everything except one thing, which was the ability to be just like God. And there's something about our human nature, if we don't give it over to the Spirit, that says, I always have to have the one thing I don't have. Doesn't matter all the things I do have, I have to have that one thing. So he comes there and says, did God really say that? You know why God said that? Not to eat? Because he knows you'll be just like him. And they begin to think, this is a good setup. We've got everything. This is a beautiful place. But we could have even more. Let's say Pastor Dan was a reporter in those days, and he went out with the television crew, and he said to Adam and Eve, what do you not have? Until Satan came, they wouldn't be able to name anything. They said, well, we pretty much have everything. I mean, look at the place we live. I mean, we have everything. But then Satan always comes along and says to us, guess what God hasn't given you? Guess what God doesn't want you? Look at this. And he wants us to focus, just like the cow out the fence. He wants us to see what's on the other side of the fence. He doesn't want us to see the acres we have. There was a radio station in Waco, Texas. It's called Wild 104. It's not a Christian station. I know you were thinking it probably was. It's not a Christian station. They have something they called the War of the Roses. I tell you, it was a kind of a strange contest. The War of the Roses, they actually they said to women, first of all, if you think there's a chance your husband may not be faithful, call us and give us his name and number. The guys are thinking, well, that's really dirty pool. And so they get this list of names, and so they call these guys, they put them on the air, and they say, hey, this is Wild 104. You won a dozen roses. Tell us where you'd like to have it sent. Out of 27 winners, only 3 had them sent to their wives. I think that comes under the be sure your sin will find you out category. Can you hear the stories now? Well, this person never got flowers. I can hear all the stories now. The point was, when there's something in our heart, Satan always reaches in, takes hold of it, and says, you could have this, you could have that. David had just about everything. He had people dancing in the street, chanting his name. He'd won all these battles. But the Bible tells us, evidently, even though he had everything, he's on top of the world. There's not a man on the face of the earth at his time that had more. He decided he would stay home when it was time to go off to war. And he's up on his rooftop, and he's looking. And he sees something he doesn't have. It's another woman. And he sends for the other woman. And after she comes, he begins a relationship with this woman. And to cover it up, he ends up having her husband killed. Not directly killed, but indirectly he brings him back. And the husband's so faithful, he won't come into the house because he is a fighting man. He is serving God. He ends up in all of this trouble because at some point, having everything wasn't enough. You remember her name, Leona Helmsley? Doesn't she look like just a lovely lady? She was one of the richest people in the country years ago. She was basically a slumlord in New York City. She was worth millions and millions of dollars. They ended up putting her in prison for tax evasion. She's got more money than she could count, but she's doing everything she can to keep even more. They end up putting her in prison. What a lot of people don't know is her son died during that time, and he had like $140,000 estate, and she sued to get all of the estate, leaving his wife and children with just a few $1,000s, because it didn't matter how much she had, it was never enough. Now, at this point, you ought to be saying, this is about the worst news I've ever heard in the world. He's just gone through all this. Let me tell you the good news. The good news is God knows we're restless. He knows there are places in our heart that need to be filled. And He wants to fill them. Jesus and the disciples are going through Samaria. Now, Samaria wasn't the long way around. It was actually the shortcut. But for so long, Samaria had been the area they wouldn't go through. Now, if you remember the stories, when all the Israelites got exiled away, the ones that were left behind began to marry in with the Egyptians and the people surrounding, and they compromised everything. And then when the Israelites came back, these Samaritans were the people that had basically compromised all their principles and they had to fight against. And so even though they were kind of family, they really didn't like each other because of what they had done. They had basically given everything away. And so they go through Samaria, and Jesus is waiting at the well. Remember, the disciples go on to get food. It's in the middle of the day. Now, if you've ever been in the Middle East, the middle of the day is the hottest part of the day. It's the time when nobody comes to get water, right? Except this lady. And she comes to draw water, and Jesus asks her for water. Now, I don't have time to tell you all the cultural barriers he broke then. He really shouldn't be speaking to this woman because of her past. He really wouldn't be speaking to a foreign woman. And she said something about, why do you ask me for water? And here's what Jesus said. If you knew who I was, you would ask me for water, and you'd never thirst again. Paul says sanctify through and through. Thanksgiving's not far away. I know the ladies are excited because you get to cook and all the guys come over and watch football. That's a really exciting time. I don't know what it looks like at your house, but most Thanksgiving dinners, people gather around the table. And you may or may not have a ritual. You may just eat until, I can pretty much, I bet Pastor Dan does the same thing I do. He eats until he cannot eat anymore, and then he begins to shift. You know, if you can just move in a certain way and rest a while, then you can get a little more in. Then you don't exercise. Exercise, you just kind of shift around a little bit until you can eat more, right? I see some guys like I've connected with some of. Well, here's this nice traditional family. They're sitting around the table, and they're a good family because the lady's got on a scarf. I mean, anytime a lady wears a scarf, I mean, everything's just the world's perfect. All these things, and so they'll say, "This is what we're thankful for," right? I mean, some of your families do that. You talk about the things you're thankful for. That's sanctifying through, if you will. In other words, I'm thankful. That's the outside. I'm thankful for this. I want you to know God's given us so much. He's blessed us. And we usually say things like, well, we have a roof over our heads, when most of us have never lived anywhere where we didn't have a roof over our heads. We have food where most of us have never gone without food. Our families help. We try to say all these things because they're the right thing to say, right? Now, what happens about 8 o'clock on Thanksgiving night? If we can go to the next slide. They lift the gate at Walmart and people trample each other. You know why? Because sitting around the table was all talk. None of it was real. And somebody's got a TV that you can get for $50 less than you could normally get it, and you will kill somebody if they get between you and that TV. We have 3 daughters. 2 of them went a couple of Thanksgivings ago just to watch. They didn't even want to buy anything. They just wanted to go watch. And they went to Walmart. They said, it was crazy. I mean, forget WWE and all this stuff. Just film Walmart. And most of these people are people that sat around the table earlier that day talking about how God had given them everything they wanted. And then they begin looking at the Black Friday ads, and they begin plotting and say, He's given us everything we want, but this. That's through and through. That means that you can sit at the table. I'm not saying it's a sin to go shopping on Thanksgiving. I'm not saying it's bad to get good deals. What I'm saying is when you say He's given you everything you need, you actually don't just say it, you mean it. I want to tell you something. If the 100 or so people that are gathered here today went out into this culture and said, you know what? I began to look at my pasture. I began to look, and there's grass on the other side of the fence, but I don't see any need to get myself up to my neck in barbed wire because God has given me things on this side that are great. I'm not saying cut out initiative. I'm not saying don't try, don't work hard. I'm just saying have something inside that gives glory to God and says, God, I deeply thank you for what you've done. Couple of quick stories and then I'm done. First one. Years ago I was pastoring over in Shelby and had a man that was going to have open heart surgery. I'm really going to go old school on you. I'm going to be 51 soon, so I can tell stories you don't know anything about. But have any of you ever been in what they call a ward in the hospital? Okay, I've got a few not. A ward is just basically worse than a semi-private room. You have like 4 or 5 people in one room. It's kind of like ICU, except you don't have the dividers. I mean, you just have an open room. So this was years ago. It was back in the late 80s, and I was there. The man was having open heart surgery. I was in the ward, and there were, if I recall, 4 people in this room. Now, this guy was acting cool, but he was wired. Now, if I was having open heart surgery, I'd be wired too. But I mean, he was, hey, they say this surgery is going to go pretty good. I think the doctor's pretty good. Y'all think he's pretty good. I'm going to have this surgery. I think everything's going to be fine. I'm not worried about this thing at all. And I'm like, good gracious, they need to give this man some drugs. They need to give him something. I mean, this guy he is as nervous as he can be, which, again, I get it. I'm just saying he is wired. Well, we have to wait and wait, because this is what they do in the hospital. They put you in, they give you an open heart surgery time of like 6 o'clock in the morning, then they leave you laying in your room till 6 o'clock in the afternoon to see if your heart really is bad and if it explodes during the day, and then they finally take you down to surgery. So he's sitting there, he's been sitting all day, and during that time I met the guy behind him, and he was an African-American gentleman, and he was in his 70s, helped some in his church, worked at a funeral home, volunteered or did some work at a funeral home. Just a blessing, just a great guy to meet. I'd talk to him a little bit. The family, there'd be a lot of family, and I would kind of slip over and talk to him. And slip over means just turn in the chair because the sheet hadn't been pulled. We're all just sitting in an open room. So doctor comes in to see this older gentleman. The other guy sitting over there, he's still talking. He has not breathed in 3 hours. I mean, he just laying it all out there. And so the doctor comes in to see this older gentleman. They pull the curtain around, and I'm not eavesdropping. It's just the room's so tight. I'm up against the curtain. All the family's over there, and they're all talking to the guy, and I'm standing in the back, but I can hear the doctor talking to the man behind me. And he basically says, "Sir, there's nothing we can do. You're not a candidate for a transplant. We've done everything we can. That's all we can do." And he talks for a minute, and then he leaves, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh my goodness. And so after he leaves, the man pulls the sheet back, and Mr. I'm not nervous, I'm not worried, who's talking, turns and looks at him, and you know how when the whole room goes quiet, and he says to him, "What did the doctor say?" And that man said, "You know those doctors, you can't figure out half of what they tell you." He said, "Yeah, I know," and he goes right back on. Goes down to surgery. His surgery is fine. I went up later to see that man. I said, "Sir, I really appreciate what you did. I mean, he would have had a heart attack right there. His heart would have exploded if you'd have told him what the doctor said." He said, "God's given me a great life. And you and I know that it's about to get better." What if we had people like us that said to people, "Whatever comes, I know He has it in control"? Last story, I'm done. Little lady in my home church. Godliest woman I've ever known. I mean, she just didn't matter what comes. In one short period, people broke into their business and beat her and her husband. They were in their late 60s, beaten pretty badly. Their granddaughter gets leukemia, and her son was a used car dealer. He was taken out for a test drive, and the young boy always wanted a Corvette, so he took his pistol out, shot him in point-blank range, killed him, hit his body. All this happened at one time. I'll still remember, 14, 15 years old, sitting on the porch at her house, and she's going around comforting people. And she's saying, "Listen, the Lord is in control. Ted's in a much better place. I mean, still bruised, and still have all these problems." And I'm thinking, either she is in complete denial or she has something I'd love to have. Amen. So it's years and years later, late in her life, I go by the nursing home to see her. She's got dementia. She thinks I'm my father. She asked me about her son who's been killed. She obviously does not really keyed into what's going on. And I said to her before I left, I said, "Miss Mary," I said, could I pray for you?" And she said, "Sure you could." And I said, "Well, how could I pray? What do you need?" And I'll never forget, she looked at me and she said, "My needs aren't that great. And He has always met them." Wow. Not anywhere near the fence, not even looking at the grass on the other side, just out in the pasture, enjoying what God's given. I don't know what this means to all of you. I don't even know any of you well enough to know where you are, but I do know this. I believe the boundary lines have fallen in pleasant places. If He is who we believe He says He is, and He is in control, then He has laid things out for us. The question is, have I been sanctified through and through so that what I say is actually what I really believe in my core? And I say to people, the boundary lines are in pleasant places. Father, as we close today, I thank You for this church and for these people. And as I've shared today, You know every thought that has occurred in every heart of every person in this room. You know the concerns, you know the desires, you know the needs. Lord, let us trust and believe that when you lay out the boundary lines of our life, you don't do so in a punitive way or a hostile way. You do so in a way that's best for us. And give us that confidence that we may say to others, guess what kind of God I have? Guess what He's done for me? As you do that, we'll be careful to give you thanks. In Christ's name, God's people said, Amen. Amen.